let my friend crash at my place. Then the police showed up. It started on a rainy Thursday evening, the kind where the streets gleam with reflections of neon signs and the air smells faintly of wet asphalt and something metallic. I had just settled in with a cup of tea, ready to binge a show I'd been meaning to watch all week when my phone buzzed. It was her, Lena, my friend since college, the one who could always make me laugh even in the worst moods. But the tone of her message wasn't playful. "Can I crash at your place tonight? I have complications." Complications was an understatement, I realized as soon as I read it. Lena rarely asked for help, and when she did, it was usually urgent, tangled, and messy. I hesitated for a moment, glancing at my small apartment and the neatness I prized, the life I had carefully arranged. But then I remembered the times she had bylaid me out, the nights she had driven 2 hours just to make sure I wasn't alone after a breakup, the countless small kindnesses that had been the invisible scaffolding of our friendship. So, of course, I said yes. Within an hour, she was at my door, soaked and shivering, carrying a small duffel bag that smelled faintly of smoke and perfume. I barely recognized her. The hair that was usually meticulously styled hung damp around her face, and there was a shadow under her eyes I hadn't seen before. She stepped in without waiting for an invitation, dropping her bag with a thud. "Thanks," she muttered, voice low, and I realized just how exhausted she must be. I offered her a towel, a mug of tea, anything that would make her feel a little less exposed, a little less like she had dragged her chaos into my carefully curated world. And she accepted, quietly, like she had been expecting judgment but found none. We sat in my living room, the rain tapping against the window, sharing small talk that was neither comforting nor truly awkward. It was simply a bridge, a temporary tether to normalcy. She told me fragments, hints of the storm that had blown her here, avoiding the details that made me nervous, and I let her. Sometimes listening was enough. Around midnight, she finally asked if she could use the guest room. I showed her, nodding the way she inspected everything as if deciding whether it was safe, acceptable, livable. She flopped onto the bed without caring about the sheets I had changed that afternoon, pulled the blanket over herself, and sighed, a sound so raw it made my stomach twist. I left her to settle in, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing against the edges of my calm night. Sleep didn't come easy. My mind kept replaying the image of her face, exhausted and worn, and I realized I had no idea what I was walking into. My apartment, usually a sanctuary, now felt like a stage where the first act of a disaster had already begun, and I wasn't sure whether to brace myself or hope for the best. The hours crawled by, punctuated by the occasional rumble of thunder, and I began to wonder if I had made a mistake. But when I checked on her, she was asleep, almost peaceful, the storm temporarily at bay. And for a moment I let myself believe it would be okay. That was the first mistake. The next morning I woke to silence, but not the quiet that feels like calm. It was too tense, too deliberate, like the world was holding its breath. Lena was already awake, standing by the window, phone in hand, face pale. "We have a problem," she said without looking at me. My stomach dropped. "What happened?" I asked, heart thudding. She finally turned, eyes wide, lips pressed tight. I think the police are looking for me." My mind went blank. "Why?" I demanded, though a part of me already feared the answer. She didn't meet my gaze. "It's complicated," she said, and in that one word, 1,000 unspoken truths hung suspended between us. The kind of complications that didn't belong in an apartment like mine, that didn't belong anywhere near my carefully managed life. And suddenly, the warmth I had offered last night, the small kindnesses that had felt so necessary, began to feel like a trap. I realized I had invited chaos into my home, chaos that was now threatening to knock down every boundary I had worked so hard to maintain. My hands trembled slightly as I tried to process what she was saying. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflective, the world washed clean of normalcy, ready for the mess that was about to descend. Lena glanced at me, hesitation clear in her posture. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she whispered. But it had happened, and now the consequences were inching closer, inevitable and terrifying. My heart pounded as I glanced at the clock. Any moment the knock could come, the uniformed strangers could appear, and I would have to explain, defend, or protect. And I realized in that instant that nothing in my life had prepared me for what was about to unfold. I tried to keep my breathing steady, telling myself that panic wouldn't help, but every instinct screamed at me that we were in way over our heads. Lena paced the apartment, phone pressed to her ear, muttering half-formed sentences, her usual confidence replaced by a raw, jittery vulnerability I had never seen before. I wanted to intervene, to ask questions, to demand explanations, but the words wouldn't form. I realized that part of me didn't want to know yet, didn't want to face the full extent of whatever mess she had brought into my home. Time stretched, each minute elongating like a shadow across the floor, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. The apartment, my sanctuary, felt suddenly small, claustrophobic, as though it were conspiring with the world outside to force me to confront chaos head-on. Then came the knock. Just one, firm, deliberate, and I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs, my throat tightening. Lena's eyes met mine, wide and pleading, and for a fraction of a second I considered running, hiding, pretending I didn't know her. But she was frozen too, and I knew the reality couldn't be avoided. I opened the door slowly, the hallway beyond drenched in bright fluorescent light that made the rain-slicked street glisten like glass. Two officers stood there, professional but unsmiling, badges glinting, not a hint of warmth in their demeanor. "Good morning," one said, clipboard in hand. "We're looking for Lena Matthews." My mind raced. "Yes," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "She's here." The officer's expression didn't change, but I could feel the weight of authority pressing down, the subtle shift in energy that reminded me how fragile my control of this situation really was. Lena moved beside me, ducking slightly, her body tense, her eyes darting from me to the officers and back. I suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, not just for her, but for what would happen next. I knew nothing would be simple. The officers asked questions, their tone polite but firm. Lena's answers were clipped, defensive, and I could see the fear flickering behind her eyes. Each word she spoke seemed to confirm that the situation was worse than I had imagined, a mess tangled in legal complications and poor choices, and I was caught in the middle. I tried to stay calm, to offer support without interfering, but it was impossible to remain neutral. The officers asked if she had been staying here long, if anyone else knew of her location, and I answered honestly, my mind spinning with the potential consequences of my candor. Every answer felt like a gamble, a delicate negotiation between truth, loyalty, and self-preservation. Lena shifted beside me, whispering hurriedly, words barely audible over the tension. "I didn't think it would come to this. I just needed a place to crash." Her voice broke slightly, and I realized that underneath the chaos and fear, she was just a person, exhausted, desperate human. The officers exchanged a few quiet words, then turned their attention back to me. "We need to speak with her further," one said, a note of finality in his tone. I nodded, feeling my stomach drop. This wasn't just a casual inquiry. It was serious, and it was about to drag me into a world I had carefully kept at bay. Lena gave me a brief, almost imperceptible look, a silent plea for understanding, and I felt the weight of the choice I had made by letting her in. It was no longer just a favor. It had become a decision that carried real consequences, ones that could ripple far beyond my small apartment and the safety I had constructed around my life. As the officers guided her toward the door, I struggled to reconcile the chaotic reality of the situation with the comforting illusions I had maintained until now. The rain outside had stopped, but the world felt irrevocably altered, and I knew that nothing would ever feel ordinary again. I was left standing in the hallway, the door slightly ajar, listening to the faint click of the car doors as they left, and a strange, heavy quiet settled over me. Lena was gone, at least for now, and with her went a portion of the innocence I had maintained about my carefully ordered life. I sank back into my apartment, breathing heavily, my mind racing through possibilities, consequences, and regrets. I realized that I had been naive in thinking that kindness could exist without cost, that offering a safe place didn't carry risk, that helping a friend wouldn't entangle me in the complexities of their choices. The morning sun filtered weakly through the curtains, but it brought no warmth. Everything felt sharper, more urgent, more real. And I understood, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that life had just changed in ways I couldn't control. I wasn't just a bystander anymore. I was implicated, connected, responsible in a way that went far beyond a casual friendship. And as I sank to the floor, my mind still spinning with fear, questions, and disbelief, I realized the truth. Letting her in had seemed simple, even compassionate, but it had also opened a door to consequences I had no idea how to navigate. The rest of the day was a blur of tension and restless thoughts. I couldn't focus on anything, not the emails piling up on my laptop, not the half-drunk cup of tea I kept reheating, not even the persistent hum of the city outside. Every sound, the creak of my floors, the distant siren, the buzz of a neighbor's vacuum, felt amplified like the world was holding its breath with me. I kept glancing at my phone, half-hopping for a message from Lena explaining everything, half dreading it. But there was nothing. Silence. The kind that presses down on your chest and makes the hours feel heavier, longer, suffocating in its emptiness. I tried to imagine what had happened after the police left. Were they taking her somewhere official? Was she scared? Angry, hurt. My mind spun with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. And then there was me, trapped in my own apartment, alone, questioning every choice that had led to this moment. Letting her in had been impulsive, yes, but it had also felt necessary at the time. I had thought I was helping, that I was offering temporary shelter from a storm she couldn't manage on her own. But now, reality had collided with intention, and the consequences were bigger than I could have imagined. Hours passed. I paced the living room, stopping only to stare out the window at the gray sky and empty streets. The apartment, normally a sanctuary, felt like a cage, walls closing in with the weight of uncertainty and fear. I remembered every detail of Lena's face that morning. Her exhaustion, the shadow under her eyes, the way she had flinched when the officers arrived. I couldn't shake the image. It pressed into my mind, haunting and inescapable. And yet, beneath the worry and fear, there was something else, an undeniable sense of responsibility. I had let her in, yes, but that meant I was now part of this story, entangled in consequences I couldn't avoid. It was no longer a question of whether I had done the right thing, but what I would do next. I tried calling her, messaging her, any attempt to reach out, but my efforts were met with silence. The hours stretched, and anxiety twisted tighter in my chest with every unanswered call. I had imagined scenarios, some terrifying, some improbable, none comforting, and each one seemed more plausible than the last. And still, I waited, unwilling to leave my apartment, unwilling to let go of the fragile thread connecting me to the chaos that had invaded my life. That evening, just as the light outside began to dim into a murky twilight, there was a knock at the door. My heart jumped into my throat. Could it be them again? Another officer. Or worse, someone else entirely, summoned by the ripple of events I couldn't yet comprehend. I approached slowly, hand trembling as I reached for the knob. Peering through the peephole, I saw her, Lena, soaked again, hair plastered to her face, eyes wide with panic, hands clutching the small duffel bag she'd abandoned earlier. Relief and dread collided in my chest. I opened the door, and she stumbled inside without a word, collapsing onto the sofa in a heap of shivering limbs and frantic energy. They want to talk to me again, she gasped, voice barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. I knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder, feeling the heat of her fear radiate through her thin hoodie. Okay, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, steady, a lifeline in the storm. We'll figure it out, together. She shook her head, pulling at her damp hair, and I realized that whatever had started this chain of events was bigger than I could imagine, bigger than I had prepared for. And yet, even in the midst of terror and confusion, I knew one thing. I couldn't let her face it alone. We spent the night planning, whispering, strategizing, and sometimes just sitting in tense silence, waiting for the next inevitable knock. There was no comfort, only the slow accumulation of understanding that the life I had known, the neat, predictable routines, the sense of safety, the boundaries I thought were absolute, had been shattered in a single act of kindness. And now, the story of that kindness was moving faster than I could control, dragging me into consequences I had never anticipated, leaving me breathless, terrified, and fiercely aware that nothing would ever be the same. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain again, soft and persistent, tapping against the windows like a quiet warning. Lena was already up, packing the living room, phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and urgent. I tried to make coffee, tried to steady myself, but the aroma did little to calm the storm inside me. Every sound, the clink of a spoon against a mug, the distant hum of traffic, seemed magnified, charged with the tension that had settled in the apartment overnight. Lena ended her call abruptly, throwing the phone onto the couch beside her. "They're serious this time," she muttered, voice tight, eyes wide. "It's more than a warning." I felt my chest tighten. "What do you mean? Who are we talking about?" She didn't answer immediately, instead staring out the window, shoulders tense. Finally, she turned, her gaze piercing, desperate. They want to speak in person. They said it's not optional. My mind raced. Who they were didn't matter in that moment. The reality was clear. The situation had escalated, and I had no choice but to participate. I realized with a jolt of fear that my safe apartment, the boundaries I had cherished, had dissolved in a single night, leaving me exposed and implicated. We sat down, mapping out possibilities, discussing whether she should leave, whether I should stay out of it, whether the police needed to be called ahead of time or avoided altogether. Each scenario felt like a tightrope, a balance between survival, loyalty, and legality. I could see the panic in her eyes, the same panic I felt mirrored in myself. And yet, beneath the fear, there was an unspoken bond forming in that tense silence. Whatever came next, we were in it together. Hours passed. The tension thickened like smoke in a closed room, every knock on the door or unexpected sound setting my nerves on edge. I tried to distract myself, cleaning the apartment, doing anything that gave the illusion of control, but nothing could dissipate the anxiety that had rooted itself in my chest. The weight of the previous day's events pressed on me, magnified by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. And then the doorbell rang. My stomach lurched. Lena froze mid-step, her hand hovering near the sofa where the phone still lay. I held my breath, each second stretching into an eternity. I reached the door slowly, heart hammering against my ribs, and opened it to reveal two uniformed officers, expressions professional, unreadable. "Good morning," one said, clipboard in hand. "We need to speak with Lena Matthews." Her face drained of color, and I felt an instinctive surge of protectiveness. "She's here," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Every part of me screamed to retreat, to pretend I knew nothing, but my conscience held me in place. The officers glanced past me into the apartment, nodding nothing in particular, and then focused on Lena. Their questions were direct, probing, leaving no room for evasion. Lena's responses were cautious, measured, but I could see the fear flicker behind her eyes, the weight of each word pressing down like a physical force. I tried to offer reassurance silently, placing a hand briefly on her shoulder, feeling the tremor beneath her thin hoodie. Time stretched in that living room, each second a suspended moment of tension and inevitability. I realized then that I was no longer a passive observer. My decisions, my presence, my honesty, were all part of the unfolding story, entangling me in consequences I had never anticipated. After what felt like hours, the officers left temporarily, citing paperwork and protocol, but the tension lingered, an invisible residue that clung to the air. Lena slumped onto the sofa, exhaustion and fear mingling in her posture. I sat beside her, unsure what to say, realizing that nothing I could offer would fully alleviate the storm she faced. I poured both of us cups of tea, silently hoping the warmth might bring comfort, however fleeting. Over the next few hours, we planned our next steps, discussing lawyers, possible statements, and what to expect in the coming days. Each option seemed fraught with uncertainty and risk, but avoidance was no longer possible. The world outside my apartment, once familiar and manageable, now felt like a labyrinth, with rules I didn't understand and dangers I couldn't predict. Lena's stories, only fragments shared, hinted at mistakes, misunderstandings, and entanglements that extended far beyond my small, orderly life. And I realized that my act of kindness, the decision to let her stay, had become the catalyst for a series of events that I could not control. The day passed slowly, the rain eventually ceasing but leaving the streets slick and reflective, mirroring the uncertainty in my mind. Lena slept fitfully, but I couldn't, staring out the window, imagining every possible outcome, every potential consequence. I felt my sense of security slipping, replaced by an acute awareness of responsibility and complicity. By evening, I knew I had to brace myself. This was not a temporary crisis. It was a turning point, a moment that would test loyalty, courage, and resilience in ways I had never imagined. And as darkness fell, I realized that the life I had carefully constructed, the neat routines, the boundaries, the illusion of safety, had been irrevocably altered. The story had moved beyond friendship, beyond kindness, and into a realm where every decision carried weight, and every action could have consequences that would ripple far beyond the walls of my apartment. The next morning, I woke to the persistent hum of anxiety buzzing in my chest, a tension that made even the simplest movements feel deliberate and heavy. Lena was awake before me, packing the living room, phone pressed to her ear again, muttering under her breath. The shadows under her eyes had deepened overnight, and her hands trembled slightly whenever she gestured or ran them through her damp hair. I tried to keep myself calm, making coffee, taking slow breaths, telling myself that I could handle this, that we could navigate whatever storm had been unleashed. But the truth was, I had no idea what we were walking into, and every instinct screamed that I was about to be dragged into chaos far beyond my control. Hours passed in a tense rhythm, punctuated by knocks and phone calls that made my stomach churn with dread. I kept replaying the previous encounters with the police in my head, each question, each glance, each deliberate pause a reminder that we were now entangled in consequences that weren't just Lena's but mine as well. Then, in the late afternoon, a sharp, insistent knock at the door froze me mid-step. My heart thundered. Lena flinched, pressing herself against the sofa, whispering, "This is it. They're here." I approached slowly, hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob, and opened it to reveal two officers, professional and unsmiling, badges gleaming under the dim light. "We need to speak with Lena Matthews," one said, tone neutral but firm. She froze, staring at me with wide eyes as if pleading silently for a way out. I swallowed hard and stepped aside. "She's here," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. They entered, their presence filling the apartment, shifting the energy into something heavier, more urgent. The questioning began immediately, precise and relentless. They asked where she had been, who she had contacted, and whether she had been involved in certain incidents that, I realized with a cold jolt, were serious. Serious enough that I could not have imagined the consequences spilling into my world when I had agreed to let her stay. Lena's answers were measured, careful, and I watched the flicker of fear in her eyes, the quick intake of breath before each reply. I felt a surge of protectiveness, my mind racing through every possible scenario, every way I could intervene, every choice that might mitigate the damage. But I also knew that speaking out of turn could worsen things, that the smallest misstep could send the consequences spiraling beyond our control. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. The officers occasionally conferred quietly, and I caught fragments of their conversation, enough to sense the gravity of the situation. I realized then that my small apartment, my sanctuary, had become a stage for something much larger, and we were players in a story we hadn't written. Lena slumped against the sofa, exhaustion and tension etched into every line of her body. I moved closer, sitting beside her, offering a hand on her shoulder, feeling the tremor beneath her hoodie. "We'll get through this," I whispered, though even as I spoke, uncertainty gnawed at my certainty. The officers left briefly, claiming paperwork and procedure, and I exhaled, a shaky relief flooding me even as the tension lingered, an invisible weight pressing against the walls. Lena's voice trembled when she spoke, low and urgent. "I didn't know it would get this bad. I thought I could handle it. I just needed a place to stay." I nodded, understanding both the desperation and the recklessness, the human frailty that had brought us here. And I realized that whatever sympathy I felt could not undo the reality. The authorities were involved, and our lives were now intertwined with consequences neither of us could escape. Over the next hours, we strategized quietly, moving in small circles, weighing every choice, trying to anticipate the next knock, the next call. Each moment was heavy with fear and anticipation, and the apartment, once a haven, felt like a pressure cooker, holding the heat of events that had spiraled far beyond any control. As darkness fell, I found myself staring at the window, watching the street outside, the reflections of streetlights glistening on wet asphalt, a mirror to the chaos and uncertainty within. I realized that letting her in had been an act of kindness, yes, but also the catalyst for a reality I had no preparation for, a world of uncertainty, responsibility, and consequence that pressed in from all sides. And yet, despite fear, despite the heaviness, I felt a fierce awareness of connection. We were in this together, caught in the storm, and I could not abandon her. Not now, not ever. Night fell, and the apartment grew silent except for the occasional hum of traffic outside, a lull in the tension that was more temporary than comforting. Lena slept fitfully, and I sat awake, heart racing, mind replaying every question, every glance, every potential outcome. I realized with a chilling clarity that the life I had thought was controlled, neat, and safe had been irrevocably altered. I had opened the door for a friend, and in doing so, had invited a storm that threatened to consume everything in its path. The responsibility weighed on me, not as guilt alone, but as an active, pressing force. We would navigate this, or we would fail, and there would be no neutral ground. And as I stared into the darkness, every nerve alive with anticipation, I understood fully for the first time that kindness, once extended, could never be taken back, and the consequences of that choice had begun to unfold with relentless momentum. The next day felt impossibly long, each minute dragging with a weight that pressed against my chest, a constant reminder that nothing in my life had prepared me for this. Lena barely slept, and when she did, it was restless, fragmented, full of whispered mutterings and sudden movements that made my stomach knot every time. I tried to keep myself occupied, cleaning, organizing, even packing, anything to create the illusion of control. But the reality was undeniable. The authorities were circling, and the consequences of letting her stay in my apartment had become unavoidable. Around midday, a sharp knock rattled the door. My heart leapt and I froze, listening intently. Lena's wide-eyed panic mirrored my own. I took a slow breath and opened the door to find two officers standing there, clipboard and badge glinting, professional but implacable. "We need to speak with Ms. Matthews again," one said, and my stomach twisted into knots. Lena stepped forward, trembling, but I reached for her arm, grounding her with a small, steadying touch. "We'll do this," I whispered, though my own voice quavered. They entered, and the questioning began immediately, sharp, precise, probing deeper than before. I watched her carefully measure her words, seeing the fear in her eyes, the way she paused before each response, calculating, balancing honesty against self-preservation. I felt a surge of protectiveness I couldn't ignore. Every answer she gave seemed to make the situation more tangible, more real, and yet also more precarious. Time stretched endlessly. I could see the subtle judgments, the flickers of doubt in the officers' expressions, though they remained professionally neutral. And then, without warning, one of them asked a question that froze me in place. It wasn't the question itself that shocked me, but the implication, the hidden weight behind it. Lena's face paled, and she looked at me like I might provide an answer, a lifeline, anything to diffuse the tension. But I couldn't. I didn't know the answer, and even if I did, speaking would risk making the situation worse. I felt trapped, caught between loyalty and the creeping realization that my life was now tangled in consequences far beyond what I had imagined when I had agreed to let her stay. The hours that followed were a blur. The officers left and returned intermittently, each visit more tense, more urgent, each glance and question sharpening the edges of anxiety in the room. Lena whispered fragments of explanations between visits, hints of past mistakes and poor decisions, but never enough for me to fully understand what we were facing. And I realized that partial knowledge was almost worse than none at all. It left room for fear to fill the gaps, for my imagination to spiral into worst-case scenarios that felt as real as the events themselves. By late afternoon, the tension in the apartment was almost unbearable. I watched Lena packing, clutching her duffel bag like a lifeline, and I felt a mix of fear, frustration, and fierce protectiveness. I wanted to shield her from the consequences, to somehow absorb the storm myself, but I knew that was impossible. And yet, I also knew that abandoning her was not an option. The weight of responsibility pressed on me, relentless, reminding me with every tick of the clock that we were in this together, whether we wanted to be or not. Evening came, and with it, a temporary lull. Lena slumped onto the sofa, exhaustion evident in every line of her body, and I sat beside her, unsure what to say, trying only to be present. The silence between us was heavy but necessary, a pause in the storm, a moment to gather strength for what we both knew was coming. And then, as the sun set and shadows stretched across the apartment, another knock echoed through the hallway, more insistent, more deliberate, carrying the weight of inevitability. My heart raced. This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened the door, and the two officers stood there, their expressions unreadable but their presence undeniably authoritative. Lena froze beside me, and I placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her, silently signaling that we would face this together. They stepped in, and the questions began anew, more intense, more probing, focused now not just on facts but on inconsistencies, motivations, and consequences. Each question, each pause, each careful glance seemed designed to unravel the tangled threads of our lives, to expose the reality that we were now irrevocably entangled in a situation we could not escape. I watched Lena respond with caution, her body tense, every word measured, and I felt a surge of empathy and fear so intense it was almost physical. Time blurred, minutes stretched into hours. I realized with a sickening clarity that my act of kindness, letting her stay, had become the linchpin in a chain of events that could not be undone. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a courtroom, the walls closing in with every passing moment, the air thick with tension and unspoken judgment. And yet, beneath the fear, I found a flicker of determination. We would endure this. We would navigate it together. Whatever consequences awaited, whatever storms were coming, I would not abandon her. Because the truth of the matter was stark and undeniable. I had made a choice, and that choice had consequences, and the only way forward was to face them head-on, with courage, loyalty, and the unyielding awareness that our lives had changed forever. Night fell like a heavy curtain, draping the city in shadows and leaving my apartment illuminated only by the dull glow of the streetlights outside. Lena was quiet now, curled up on the sofa, phone clutched tightly in her hands, her breathing shallow and uneven. I sat across from her, legs pulled close, trying to focus on anything other than the gnawing anxiety in my chest, the relentless awareness that the storm we had been living in was far from over. Hours passed slowly, each second marked by the faint ticking of the clock and the occasional distant sound of sirens or a car door slamming. The tension in the apartment was palpable, thick as smoke, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. Then a sudden knock at the door made me jump, my pulse spiking. Lena stirred beside me, eyes wide, and I reached out instinctively, grounding her with a hand on her shoulder. I opened the door cautiously to find two uniformed officers standing there, their expressions neutral but their presence commanding. "We need to speak with Ms. Matthews immediately," one said, clipboard in hand. Lena's body went rigid, and I felt the tremor beneath her hoodie, the silent panic that I had been trying to help her contain. I stepped aside, silently signaling that we were ready. They entered, and the questioning began again, sharper this time, more focused, probing deeper into details that made my stomach twist with anxiety. Lena answered carefully, her words measured, eyes flicking to me for reassurance. I realized then how much depended on my silence, my presence, my ability to stay composed. Each response from her seemed to weigh on the officers, each pause and glance calculated, and I felt the invisible thread connecting all of us tighten with every moment. Time lost meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, conversations looping, questions repeated, each round more intense than the last. I watched Lena, exhausted but resilient, trying to navigate the storm, and I felt both pride and fear twisting inside me. I wanted to shield her, to absorb the tension, but I knew that was impossible. This was her storm to weather, and I was merely along for the ride, a silent anchor in the chaos. Eventually, the officers left again, citing more procedure and paperwork, leaving the apartment heavy with unspoken words and lingering fear. Lena slumped onto the sofa, a deep exhale shaking her shoulders. I moved beside her, placing a hand on her arm, offering silent support. "We'll get through this," I whispered, though the uncertainty gnawed at me. She nodded, but her eyes told a story of fear, exhaustion, and disbelief. I knew then that the worst was yet to come. The events of the day had only scratched the surface of a reality that was unraveling faster than I could comprehend. Over the next hours, we planned quietly, mapping out scenarios, anticipating questions, trying to strategize in a world that seemed intent on testing our limits. Each conversation, each decision, carried weight, and the apartment, once a safe haven, felt like the epicenter of a storm we had no control over. And then, in the quietest hour of the night, a soft buzz from my phone startled us both. It was a message from an unknown number, a simple, chilling line that read, "We know she's with you." My stomach dropped, and Lena froze beside me, eyes wide, the color draining from her face. Fear coursed through the apartment like electricity, sharp, urgent, impossible to ignore. I realized with a sickening clarity that our lives had been exposed in ways I had never imagined. The kindness I had shown, the simple act of offering a place to stay, had spiraled into a dangerous web, and the threads were tightening with every passing moment. I moved closer to Lena, trying to offer comfort, but even I could feel the tremor of fear in my own hands. We were no longer just facing legal complications, procedural questions, or the weight of authorities' scrutiny. We were in a space where the unknown threatened to consume every sense of safety we had left. And as the night stretched on, shadows dancing across the walls, I understood fully for the first time that the storm we had invited into our lives was far from over. It was relentless, inescapable, and it had a way of finding every crack, every weak point in our defenses. And yet, despite the fear, despite the exhaustion, despite the gnawing dread that had settled into my bones, I felt an unwavering resolve. We would endure this. We would navigate the chaos together. Because whatever came next, whatever danger or consequence awaited, we were in this storm together, bound by choices, loyalty, and the unshakable awareness that our lives had changed forever. The next morning dawned gray and oppressive. The city outside shrouded in mist that mirrored the uncertainty and fear pressing down on us. Lena hadn't slept much, and neither had I. My nerves wound tight from the relentless tension of the past days. I tried to make breakfast, the sound of coffee brewing and toast popping up filling the apartment, but the routine felt hollow, mechanical, a flimsy attempt to impose normalcy on a life that had been upended. Lena sat at the small kitchen table, clutching a mug like a lifeline, staring into it as if the answers to all our problems were swirling at the bottom. I moved beside her, silently offering presence rather than words, because words had become meaningless in the shadow of everything that was coming. Then came the knock at the door, sharp, insistent, impossible to ignore. My chest lurched, pulse thundering. Lena froze, eyes wide, body taut, and I knew without a word that this was the moment everything escalated. I opened the door, and 2 officers stepped in, expressions unreadable, professional, the weight of authority pressing into the room like a physical force. "We need to bring Ms. Matthews in for questioning," one said, clipboard in hand. Lena's lips parted slightly, panic rising, and I felt the familiar surge of protectiveness, a raw, instinctive need to shield her from what was coming. "I'll come with her," I said before I could stop myself, realizing with a jolt that I couldn't just watch this unfold from the sidelines. The officers glanced at me, and one nodded, acknowledging my presence but not questioning it. We left the apartment together, the air outside cold and damp, a stark contrast to the claustrophobic tension we had left behind. The walk to the police vehicle felt interminable, each step heavy, each breath a reminder of the gravity of the situation. Lena's hand brushed against mine briefly, a fleeting, desperate connection, and I felt the weight of responsibility settle squarely on my shoulders. At the station, the atmosphere was sterile, fluorescent lights harsh, the hum of machinery and distant voices amplifying the anxiety that already thrummed between us. Lena was questioned again, more thoroughly this time, and I watched, a silent anchor, as each answer seemed to stretch the limits of her composure. I could see the fear, the calculation, the exhaustion etched into her every movement, and I realized fully how deep this had gone, how intertwined our lives had become through a single act of kindness. Hours passed, time blurring into a haze of questions, forms, and interviews. I remained with her, offering support where I could, but powerless to shield her from the consequences of choices I had never made. And yet, despite the fear, despite the relentless pressure, there was a stubborn resilience in both of us, a determination to endure the storm that had engulfed our lives. Eventually, the questioning concluded, the officers leaving us with instructions, warnings, and the looming presence of consequences that could not be avoided. Lena slumped against me, exhausted, and I felt the tremor of fear and relief vibrating through her body. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving streets glistening and reflective, and I realized with a hollow clarity that nothing would ever feel normal again. The act of letting her stay, the kindness I had thought so simple, had evolved into a catalyst for chaos, consequences, and revelations that stretched far beyond my apartment walls. As we left the station, I felt a mixture of relief, fear, and profound exhaustion, the weight of responsibility pressing into my chest with every step. And yet, amidst the fear and uncertainty, there was a strange sense of clarity. We had faced the storm together, survived the relentless pressure of authority, and emerged, if not unscathed, at least intact. I understood fully in that moment that life had changed irrevocably. My world, once predictable and controlled, had expanded to include complexities, dangers, and bonds I had never anticipated. And as Lena walked beside me, leaned slightly against my arm for support, I realized that the consequences of my choice would linger, shadowing our lives. But so too would the strength, loyalty, and resilience that had carried us through. The storm was over for now. But the lessons, the tension, and the irrevocable change it had wrought would remain, a permanent reminder that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can open doors to storms far beyond what we ever imagined. The days after the police visit were strange, quiet, almost surreal. Lena had left my apartment with a promise to get her life back on track, a fragile hope that felt both inspiring and terrifying. The apartment, once filled with the constant hum of our whispered plans and tense strategizing, now felt empty, hollow, and unusually still. I wandered from room to room, touching objects, noticing the details I had ignored while chaos reigned: dust on the windowsill, the faint scent of coffee, the soft hum of the refrigerator, and realized that these walls, which had felt so small and oppressive during the storm, had also held a strange kind of safety. Alone, I allowed myself to think, to breathe, to finally confront the flood of emotions that had accumulated over the past week. Fear, yes, but also anger. Not at Lena, not at the officers, but at the way a single choice, a simple act of compassion could spiral into something uncontrollable. Guilt, too, tinged every thought. What if I had handled things differently? Could I have prevented her panic? Could I have avoided the scrutiny, the hours of anxiety, the endless uncertainty? And yet, intertwined with the guilt and fear was a deep, undeniable sense of pride. I had faced it. I had been there. I had held space for someone in need, and even though it had nearly destroyed my sense of order, my carefully curated life, I had endured. I had not abandoned her. The experience changed how I viewed friendship, loyalty, and responsibility. Kindness, I realized, was not always simple. It was not always safe. It could expose you, challenge you, even scare you. But it could also forge bonds, illuminate strength, and teach resilience in ways that comfort never could. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly began to feel like something I could manage again, though the memory of the storm lingered like a shadow. Lena called occasionally, updates punctuated with nervous laughter, grateful tones, and apologies that reflected both her relief and lingering fear. I listened, offered advice, occasionally reminders to be careful, to think ahead, to stay grounded. And I realized that my role, though less immediate, remained. My kindness had extended far beyond a single night, a single apartment, into a lesson we both carried with us. In the quiet moments, when the city hummed softly outside my windows and the apartment felt alive with familiar comfort, I reflected on everything that had happened: the fear, the tension, the relentless uncertainty, and I understood fully how much we had both grown. I had been tested, not just by circumstance, but by the choices I had made, by the responsibilities I had accepted without fully understanding their weight. And in that testing, I discovered resilience I hadn't known I possessed, courage I hadn't realized I could summon, and a loyalty that had become unshakable. Letting Lena stay had seemed like a simple act at first. It had seemed small, almost insignificant. But the consequences had been profound, far-reaching, terrifying, and ultimately transformative. I had learned that life did not wait for comfort or predictability. It demanded decisions, accountability, and the courage to face storms that often appeared without warning. And as I settled into the quiet, letting the lessons sink deep into my consciousness, I felt a strange calm, a quiet confidence. I had survived chaos, endured fear, and acted with integrity. And though the echoes of that week would remain, I knew that I had grown stronger, wiser, and more capable of facing whatever storms might come next. The apartment, once a stage for panic and uncertainty, was now a space of reflection and quiet strength. And I understood that kindness, even when it leads to unexpected storms, is never wasted. It transforms, it tests, and it teaches in ways nothing else can. And so I moved forward, carrying both the memory of fear and the knowledge of resilience, knowing that the choices I make, the kindness I extend, and the courage I summon will shape the life I live long after the storm has passed.